Long before we farmed the land, we worked the water. The evidence is in the middens, the ancient refuse heaps that archaeologists find along coastlines everywhere humans have lived. Piles of shells, fish bones, the accumulated remnants of 10,000 years of coastal eating. At sites in South Africa, in the caves along Pinnacle Point, overlooking the Indian Ocean, archaeologists have found evidence of shellfish and marine food consumption dating to 164,000 years ago. 164,000 years. Long before agriculture, long before pottery, long before anything we would recognize as civilization. The sea was a pantry. It was always a pantry. And the people who lived near it, who understood its rhythms, seasons, and moods, had access to something extraordinary. A food source rich in the specific fatty acids that human brains run on, available in abundance, requiring only the knowledge and skill to harvest it. Some researchers have argued that sustained access to marine food sources, and specifically to the omega-3 fatty acids they contain, was a significant driver of the cognitive expansion that characterizes anatomically modern humans. They essentially argue that the brain we are using to think about this question was shaped, in part, by 100,000 years of eating what the sea gave us. Today, we are talking about fish, its history, its chemistry, its extraordinary documented role in human health, and how to navigate a modern seafood market that is considerably more complicated than a tide pool. This is Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table, from Renegade Health Group. I'm Zach Sykes. Today, we go to the water. Fish is the food that fed coastlines and built trade routes and launched fishing fleets and eventually gave us the most studied dietary pattern in cardiovascular history. It is also, in the modern food environment, one of the most confusing things to shop for. The seafood counter, where the gap between the best and worst choices is nutritionally enormous, and where terms like fresh, natural, and Atlantic can mean almost nothing. We're going to fix that confusion today. History first, then the science that explains why fish specifically, not just protein, not just any animal protein, matters in ways nothing else replicates. Then a practical guide that you can use at that fish counter. Let's go. Fish, nutritionally, is not a uniform category like chicken or beef. The word covers everything from a sardine to a swordfish to a tilapia to a salmon. Animals with wildly different nutritional profiles, fat content, omega-3 density, and environmental footprints. What unites them as a food category is high-quality, complete protein. Fish is one of the most bioavailable protein sources available. It is also, in its fatty varieties, the primary dietary source of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. Compounds so critical to human brain and cardiovascular function that the story of why we don't get enough of them is one of the most important nutritional stories of the last century. The distinction between fatty fish and lean fish matters enormously for nutritional purposes. Fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, herring, anchovies, trout, they're rich in EPA and DHA. A 3-ounce serving of wild Atlantic salmon delivers roughly 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA. A 3-ounce serving of tilapia or cod, lean whitefish, delivers perhaps 100 to 200 milligrams. Both are excellent protein sources, but only the fatty fish meaningfully move the omega-3 needle. Now, where does fish get its omega-3s? From algae. Marine algae synthesize EPA and DHA at the base of the ocean food chain. Small fish, anchovies, sardines, herring, they eat the algae, or the tiny crustaceans that also eat the algae, and accumulate omega-3s in their fat. Larger fish eat smaller fish and further concentrate those fatty acids. This is why large predatory fish are high in omega-3s, and also for the same bioaccumulation reason why they can be high in mercury and other fat-soluble contaminants. The same food chain that concentrates the good stuff also concentrates the bad. We'll get back to that. First, the history. The Pinnacle Point Caves of South Africa's Cape Coast are among the most significant archaeological sites in the study of human cognitive evolution. The people who sheltered there 164,000 years ago, during a period of severe glacial cold when inland resources were scarce, they turned to the sea. Shellfish primarily, shore-based foraging that left behind accumulations of mussel, limpet, and whelk shells that have survived to tell us the story. This was not simple opportunism. The shellfish of the South African coast are not trivially harvested. They require knowledge of tidal cycles, of seasonal abundance, of which species are edible, and when. The people of Pinnacle Point had that knowledge. They had built, over generations, a relationship with the sea as a managed food source. And they were eating something extraordinary in nutritional terms. Marine shellfish and fish are among the richest source of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids that the human brain requires for development and function. DHA makes up approximately 15 to 20% of the fat in the human brain's cerebral cortex. It is not optional. It is structural. And its primary dietary source, for a population living on a coastline, was always the sea. Now, the anthropologist Michael Crawford has argued extensively that regular access to marine source DHA was a prerequisite for the development of the large, complex human brain. That without the fatty acid density of coastal food sources, the metabolic cost of growing and maintaining such an organ would have been prohibitive. This remains debated in the academic literature, as most genuinely important ideas do. What is not debated is that coastal populations throughout human prehistory had access to a nutritional profile that inland populations did not. And that profile was rich in exactly the compounds we now know are most critical for brain and cardiovascular health. Move forward 8,000 or 9,000 years and several thousand miles north, the Aegean Sea, the cradle of what we call Western civilization, and, not coincidentally, a body of water teeming with fish that fed the people who built it. Ancient Greek culture was at its material foundation substantially a fishing culture. The Mediterranean and Aegean coastlines provided abundant catches of tuna, sea bass, bream, mullet, sardines, and anchovies. Fish were eaten fresh along the coast, preserved in salt for transport inland, and fermented into sauces that flavored the cuisine of the ancient world in ways that do bear resemblance to modern Southeast Asian fish sauces. The ancient Greeks understood fish nutritionally in the way that all pre-scientific cultures understood food. through accumulated observation of effect, rather than biomechanical mechanism. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, writing in the 5th century BCE, recommended fish for the sick and the elderly, observing that it was easily digested and strengthening. He did not know about omega-3 fatty acids. He knew that people who ate fish seemed to do better. The diet of the ancient Mediterranean world, fish, olive oil, legumes, vegetables, whole grains, moderate wine, is what we now call the Mediterranean diet. It was not designed. It wasn't chosen. It was not the product of nutritional science. It was simply what people who lived around the Mediterranean ate, because it was what was available, what was affordable, and what the land and water provided. 3,000 years of eating this way produced populations with cardiovascular disease rates that would later astonish the researchers who came to study them. The Romans took the Mediterranean fishing tradition and did what Romans do. They industrialized it. With organizational genius, commercial ambition, and a degree of excess that should surprise no one familiar with Roman history. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was to Roman cuisine what soy sauce is now to East Asian cuisine, was one of the most traded commodities in the Roman Empire. It was made by layering fish, typically small fish like anchovies or mackerel, with salt in large clay vessels, and allowing them to ferment in the sun for weeks or months. The resulting liquid, intensely savory, rich in umami, and pungent enough to be detectable at significant distances. It was used in virtually every Roman recipe, from simple street food to elaborate banquet dishes. Archaeological evidence of garum production has been found from Spain to North Africa to the Black Sea coast, and Roman-era garum factories, which are identifiable by their very distinctive large clay vats. They appear along coastlines across the Mediterranean world. The trade in garum amphora was significant enough to leave a material record that archaeologists are still mapping. Pompeii, famously preserved by Vesuvius in 79 CE, had multiple garum production facilities. Garum was Pompeii's primary export. The Romans also practiced sophisticated aquaculture. They maintained vivaria, artificial fish ponds, along their coastal villas. Wealthy Romans competed to maintain the most impressive fish collections, keeping prized specimens like lampreys and moray eels as a form of conspicuous consumption. One Roman senator even reportedly spent more on constructing the canals to supply seawater to his fish ponds than on building his villa itself. This is Rome, conquering the Mediterranean world and then immediately worrying about the quality of the fish pond. While the Mediterranean world built civilization around warm water fish, the colder seas of the North Atlantic were developing their own fishing cultures, and those cultures would, in ways that are still underappreciated, shape the history of the modern world. The Basque people, whose homeland straddles the western Pyrenees between modern France and Spain, were among history's most formidable deep-sea fishermen. By the 11th century, Basque fishing fleets were working the waters of the Bay of Biscay and ranging north toward Iceland and Greenland in pursuit of the great Atlantic cod and the bowhead whale. By the late 15th century, some historians believe Basque fishermen had even reached the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, decades before Columbus's famous 1492 voyage. And they were keeping the location secret as a commercial advantage, a closely guarded knowledge of one of the richest fishing grounds on Earth. The Atlantic cod that Basque and later English, French, and Portuguese fishermen harvested from the Grand Banks in industrial quantities, it was not a luxury food. It was the protein of the poor. Salt cod, preserved in salt and dried into planks that could be stored for years without refrigeration, fed the working classes of Catholic Europe through the long Lenten fasts that prohibited meat consumption. The Church's dietary rules and the Atlantic's fish stocks were, for several centuries, co-architects of the transatlantic fishing industry. Now, the Norse fishing tradition runs parallel and equally deep. The Vikings, whose seafaring capabilities remain astonishing, sustained long ocean voyages partly through stockfish, air-dried cod, preserved without salt in the cold Arctic air of Norway, which could be rehydrated and eaten months later. Stockfish was Viking ration food, trade goods, and winter survival protein simultaneously. Norse sagas matter to historians of literature. Norse stockfish matters to historians of nutrition and economics. Now, Mark Kurlansky's book Cod, which I recommend without reservation, makes the argument that Atlantic cod shaped North American and European history more significantly than most events that appear in the history textbooks. The fishing grounds of the Grand Banks were a primary motivation for early European exploration of North America. The fishing industry that followed was among the first significant economic activities of the colonial period. Cod was currency, protein, and geopolitical prize. The scientific payoff of 3,000 years of Mediterranean coastal eating arrived in the 1950s in the form of one of the most influential studies in the history of nutrition research. Ansel Keys, an American physiologist who famously developed the K ration for U.S. troops during World War II, became fascinated in the post-war period by the striking geographical variation in heart disease rates across different countries. American men were dying of heart attacks at rates that seemed extraordinary compared to men in Southern Europe, Japan, or other parts of the world. And Keys wanted to know why. The 7 countries study, which Keys launched in 1958 and followed for decades, enrolled approximately 12,000 men in 7 countries: the United States, Finland, the Netherlands, Italy and Greece, Yugoslavia, and Japan. It tracked their diets, their cardiovascular health, and their mortality across 15 years and beyond. The findings were striking and durable. Men in Crete, the Greek island whose population eat a diet built around olive oil, fish, legumes. Sound familiar? They had the lowest rates of coronary heart disease and the highest longevity of any population in the study. Men in Finland and the United States, eating diets high in saturated animal fats and processed foods, and low in fish and plant foods, had dramatically higher rates of cardiovascular disease and earlier mortality. The 7-country study is not without its methodological critics. Keys made choices about which countries to include and which data to emphasize that have been questioned by subsequent researchers. But the core finding has been replicated across dozens of studies since. Populations eating traditional Mediterranean diet with fish as a cornerstone have dramatically better cardiovascular outcomes than populations eating Western industrialized diets. The Greek fishermen of Crete, they didn't know about EPA or DHA or Omega-3. They knew what their grandmothers cooked, what the sea provided, and what their bodies felt like when they ate it. The science, when it finally arrived, told them they'd been right all along. The professor is in, and today the professor wants to talk about a ratio. Specifically, a ratio that your body was designed to maintain and the modern food supply has systematically destroyed. And that may be the single most underappreciated factor in the chronic disease epidemic of the last 50 years. The omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Let's build this from the ground up. Omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are both essential polyunsaturated fats. Essential meaning your body cannot synthesize them and must obtain them from food. They compete for the same enzymes in your body's metabolic pathways, and they have roughly opposite effects on inflammation. Omega-6 fatty acids, particularly arachidonic acid, are precursors to pro-inflammatory signaling molecules. Omega-3 fatty acids, particularly EPA and DHA, are precursors to anti-inflammatory signaling molecules and actively resolve inflammation once it has served its purpose. Both are necessary, but the ratio between them determines which direction the balance tips. Estimates of the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in pre-agricultural human diets, they suggest a ratio of approximately 1:1, perhaps ranging up to 1:4. That's 1 part omega-3 for every 4 parts of omega-6. In this range, the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory systems are roughly balanced. Acute inflammation, the kind that heals wounds and fights infection, the good stuff, that can proceed, but chronic systemic inflammation, the kind that underlies heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, it's kept in check. The estimated omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in the modern Western diet is 1:15, and in some estimates as high as 1:20. 1:15 or 20? We have shifted the balance by a factor of 10 to 20 relative to our basic human form. And the mechanism by which this happened is almost entirely the story of industrial seed oils, a topic worth a full episode on its own, but we're going to summarize it here. The industrialization of vegetable oil production in the 20th century, soybean oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, flooded the food supply with omega-6 linoleic acid. These oils are cheap, shelf-stable, and present in virtually every processed food. They are used in commercial frying, baking, and food manufacturing at scale. Meanwhile, the shift away from fatty fish, pasture-raised animals, and wild plant foods has simultaneously reduced omega-3 intake. The ratio has been crushed from both ends. Omega-6 up dramatically, omega-3 down significantly. The result is a food supply that systematically promotes chronic inflammation in the people consuming it. This is the framework. Now, let's talk about what EPA and DHA specifically do, and why getting them from fish is not replaceable by plant-based alternatives. So plant foods contain omega-3 fatty acids in the form of ALA, alpha linoleic acid, found in flaxseed, chia seed, walnuts. ALA is an omega-3. It is beneficial, but it is not EPA or DHA. The human body can convert ALA to EPA and DHA through a series of enzymatic steps, but it's the conversion rate that's the problem. In healthy adults, the conversion of ALA to EPA is approximately 5 to 10%. The conversion to DHA is 2 to 5, and some research suggests even lower in practice. The conversion competes with omega-6 fatty acids for the same enzymes, meaning that in a high omega-6 dietary environment, the already inefficient conversion is even worse. You cannot reliably meet your EPA and DHA requirements through plant-based ALA consumption at practical dietary doses. Now, this is not an argument against plant-based diets. It's an argument for supplementing with algae-derived EPA and DHA, which is where the fish get it in the first place, and which is now very commercially available. But the point stands. EPA and DHA from marine sources are not interchangeable with ALA from plant sources. What do EPA and DHA do? EPA is the primary anti-inflammatory omega-3. It competes directly with arachidonic acid for the enzymes that produce inflammatory signaling molecules, reducing the production of pro-inflammatory prostaglandins and leukotrienes. It reduces platelet aggregation. It supports healthy triglyceride levels. Heck, high-dose EPA supplementation is one of the few interventions that reliably reduce elevated triglycerides, to the point that pharmaceutical-grade EPA is FDA approved for cardiovascular risk reduction. Now, DHA is the structural omega-3, the one embedded in cell membranes throughout the body, and in extraordinary concentration in the brain and the retina of the eye. The human brain is approximately 60% fat by dry weight. DHA makes up roughly 15 to 20% of the cerebral cortex's fatty acid content. It's not a nutrient that the brain uses, it's a nutrient that the brain is made of. Adequate DHA intake during pregnancy and early childhood is associated with improved cognitive development outcomes. Adequate DHA intake in adults is associated with reduced risk of cognitive decline, depression, and dementia. The brain's need for DHA does not diminish with age. In fact, it may increase as the aging brain becomes less efficient at retaining and utilizing the DHA it does have. The cardiovascular evidence for omega-3 fatty acids from fish and fish oil is among the most extensive in nutrition research. And, like most mature bodies of research, it's nuanced. The early epidemiological evidence was striking. Danish researchers studying Greenlandic Inuit populations in the 1970s found extraordinarily low rate of cardiovascular disease despite diets very high in fat, specifically marine fat, high in EPA and DHA. This observation launched decades of omega-3 research. Large intervention trials have shown notable benefits in specific populations. One trial found significant reductions in cardiovascular mortality in post-heart attack patients supplementing with omega-3s. Another trial, using high-dose pharmaceutical EPA in patients with elevated triglycerides, already on statins, showed a 25% reduction in major cardiovascular events. More recent large trials have shown less dramatic effects in lower risk populations supplementing at standard doses. The honest summary: omega-3s from fish and fish oil are most clearly beneficial for cardiovascular outcomes in people with existing disease or elevated risk, at doses above what typical dietary fish consumption provides. For primary prevention in healthy populations, the evidence supports regular fish consumption as part of an overall dietary pattern rather than supplementation as a substitute for dietary quality. The triglyceride effect is the most consistent and clinically documented. Omega-3 fatty acids reduce serum triglycerides reliably. This is not disputed. At doses of 2 to 4 grams of combined EPA and DHA per day, triglyceride reductions of 20 to 50% are well documented. Okay. Let's make this actionable. 3 components: what fish to eat, how to source it well, and what to do if you don't eat fish for whatever reason. Now, not all fish are equal nutritional choices for omega-3 purposes. Here's how to think about the spectrum. Tier 1. Eat these regularly. Sardines, anchovies, herring, and mackerel are the nutritional stars of the fish world and among the most underrated foods in any cuisine. They are small, which means they're low on the food chain, which means they accumulate minimal mercury, and other fat-soluble contaminants. They're fatty, which means they are rich in EPA and DHA, and they are abundant and relatively sustainable. And they are cheap. A can of quality sardines costs less than $1 and delivers more omega-3s than most fish oil supplements. A 3-ounce serving of Atlantic mackerel provides approximately 2,500 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA. Canned sardines in water or olive oil, approximately 1,400 milligrams. These are extraordinary numbers. Eat these fish 2 to 3 times per week, and you are truly moving your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in the right direction. Tier 2. Wild salmon and trout. Wild-caught salmon, Pacific varieties including sockeye, coho, and chinook, is the most nutritionally recognized fatty fish for good reason. A 3-ounce serving of wild sockeye provides approximately 1,500 milligrams of EPA and DHA, along with astaxanthin, which is the carotenoid antioxidant responsible for that pink color, and an excellent complete protein. Wild versus farmed matters significantly here, and this is where the mercury, quality, and ethical sourcing conversation converge. Wild Pacific salmon, they eat the marine food chain, small fish, krill, and crustaceans, and accumulate the omega-3s from that chain. Farmed Atlantic salmon are fed formulated feed that in lower quality operations may substitute vegetable oils for fish oil, dramatically reducing the omega-3 content of the finished fish. A farmed salmon from a low quality operation can have an omega-3 profile closer to a land animal than a wild fish. Look for wild-caught Pacific salmon specifically. Farmed salmon from certified sustainable operations, particularly in Scotland and Norway, is a reasonable alternative. Rainbow trout, particularly farmed in the United States where it is one of the most responsibly farmed fish available, it's an excellent, affordable, high omega-3 option that is often overlooked. It is consistently rated among the best environmental choices by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program. Now, Tier 3. Good protein, but lower omega-3. This is your cod, halibut, tilapia, mahi-mahi, and similar lean white fish that are excellent protein sources with lower omega-3 density. They are not the fish to choose if omega-3s are your primary goal, but they are nutritious, versatile, and appropriate as part of a varied diet. Tilapia, farmed in the United States or Canada, is a responsible environmental choice. Much imported tilapia is not. Farming practices in some countries involve high stocking densities, antibiotic use, and poor water quality. Now, we also need to talk about large predatory fish. Swordfish, shark, king mackerel, tilefish, and big-eye tuna, they accumulate mercury through the same bioaccumulation process that does also concentrate the omega-3s. The higher on the food chain, the more mercury. These fish are not poison. They're just fish worth limiting. The FDA recommends no more than 1 serving per week for adults and advises pregnant women and young children to avoid them entirely. Albacore tuna falls in the moderate category. 1 to 2 servings per week is reasonable for most adults. Canned light tuna, which is actually skipjack, it's lower in mercury and can be eaten more frequently. Now, what if you don't eat fish? Algae-derived omega-3 supplements, EPA and DHA that is extracted directly from marine algae, they're the most nutritionally direct alternative to fish for non-fish eaters. The fish get their omega-3s from algae in the first place. So algae supplementation goes 1 step up the food chain and eliminates the bioaccumulation concern entirely. Quality matters in fish oil and algae oil supplements. Look for products that have been third-party tested for oxidation. Rancid fish oil is worse than no fish oil, both in terms of efficacy and palatability. The International Fish Oil Standards Program provides independent testing certification. Now, a maintenance dose is 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA daily. A therapeutic dose for elevated triglycerides or cardiovascular risk could be closer to 2,000 to 4,000 milligrams daily, under physician guidance. Take omega-3 supplements with meals containing fat. As with vitamin D, absorption is measurably higher in the presence of dietary fat, and store them in the refrigerator to slow that oxidation and avoid the fish burps. The single most evidence-backed dietary pattern for long-term cardiovascular health and longevity is the Mediterranean diet, and fish is central to it. 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish per week. Olive oil as the primary fat, abundant vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. Moderate wine with meals if alcohol is part of your life. Limited red meat. This is not a diet in the modern sense, a temporary restriction with a start and end date. It's an eating pattern, a way of relating to food that the people of Crete and coastal Italy and the Greek islands have practiced for 3,000 years. The 7-country study found them. The Predimed trial, a large randomized controlled trial published in 2013, confirmed that a Mediterranean diet supplemented with olive oil or nuts reduced major cardiovascular events by 30% compared to a low-fat control diet. The fish in that pattern was not salmon fillets from a premium grocery store. It was whatever the sea gave. Sardines, anchovies, octopus, shellfish, the small, unglamorous fish that happened to be the most nutritionally significant ones available. The lesson is not to spend more on fish. It is to eat more fish and let the small, fatty, abundant ones be your default rather than your last resort. 164,000 years ago, someone stood at the edge of the sea at Pinnacle Point and pulled a mussel from a rock. They cracked it open with a stone and ate it. They did not know about DHA or EPA or omega-3 to omega-6 ratios or the 7-country study. They knew that the sea fed them, that it was reliable in ways the inland landscape sometimes wasn't, that the people who knew the water survived. 3,000 years of Mediterranean coastal eating produced populations that live longer with less cardiovascular disease than the industrialized world could imagine until Ansel Keys went looking for the reason. The reason was in the fish. It was always in the fish. Eat accordingly. That's episode 9 of Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table. I'm Zach Sykes, Renegade Health Group. Eat your sardines, check your tuna label, and go find some wild Pacific salmon and treat it well. Share this episode with someone who says they don't like fish. They probably just haven't had good fish prepared well. That's a different problem than the one this episode addresses, but it's worth solving too. Find us at Renegade Health Group on Facebook or Instagram. Leave a review. We are genuinely grateful for every one. Next episode, we go small. Smaller than small. We're going inside to the 100 trillion microorganisms living in your gut right now, running processes your own cells can't manage, influencing everything from your immune system to your mood to your weight. Probiotics. What they are, where they come from, what the science says, and how to use them intelligently without falling for the $80 supplement that does nothing your yogurt couldn't do better. It's a lighter episode and a fascinating one. You're not as alone in your own body as you think. Until then, eat well. Eat the fish. And remember, the sardine is your friend.